I'm going to share with you 4 tips about learning that have come from recent discoveries about how the brain works. These discoveries show how you could be learning more without any extra effort by taking advantage of the brain's natural tendencies and processes. But first, we need to take a look at how learning actually happens. In a simplified model of learning, we refer to 2 main parts of memory: short-term, sometimes called working memory, and long-term memory. Short-term memory is temporary and capacity is limited. For example, you can probably divide 351 by 13 in your head, but you probably can't do it while turning left on a busy 4-lane highway, or you shouldn't. Your short-term capacity can be increased through practice, though. Long-term memory, on the other hand, has an essentially unlimited capacity and can hold on to concepts indefinitely. The way we learn something is that we first see or hear it, and then, if we're paying attention to it, we encode it into a form that can be stored in short-term memory. Then, if we want to remember the information, we rehearse it, repeating it over and over in our mind while it resides in short-term memory, until it's consolidated. That is, it becomes stable enough to be stored in a neural pathway in long-term memory. And finally, when we need the information, we retrieve it. That process copies the information from long-term memory and places it into short-term memory, where we become aware of it and can use it. It turns out that the more frequently we try to remember an idea, the stronger and more permanent its neural pathway becomes. So here are 4 tips to help improve your learning. Tip number 1, notes are necessary. Of course, when you're listening to a lecture or reading a narrative, there's a lot of sensory input surrounding you that you're not paying attention to. Most of the things you're perceiving do not need to be remembered. But whenever you write down a note about something you want to remember, whether during a lecture or reading, you're doing 2 important brain tasks. First, you're paying attention, which ensures that encoding takes place. And second, you're summarizing information, which enhances rehearsal and consolidation. But what happens when you aren't taking notes? Won't you still remember it later? Well, maybe not. Research shows that an hour after hearing something, we'll forget more than half of what we heard, unless we do something intentional to remember it. Ebbinghaus showed us how quickly we forget things. In just 20 minutes, we've forgotten more than 1/3 of what we've just heard, and a day later, we've forgotten 2/3. That is, if we haven't done something to help us remember. Most of the time, you'll take notes to help remember what you're learning. Here's why we recommend taking handwritten notes.
Writing down your notes could help you pass your classes. Note-taking is very difficult. You have to listen, understand, and transcribe concepts all at the same time. You kind of have to get what note-taking is all about in the brain. There are 2 ways that researchers think note-taking affects your learning: the encoding hypothesis and the external storage hypothesis. Encoding is when, during the note-taking process, you listen and understand what's being said, then write it down in the time allotted before the speaker moves on to a new topic. It's tough. External storage is your brain storing information outside of itself, so it can retrieve it later. When you're writing out notes, although you're writing fewer words than when you're typing verbatim, your brain is actively summarizing the lecture material. You're encoding messages for yourself onto paper. Then when you reread the handwritten material, that's called enhanced encoding. Means you're both encoding and storing the knowledge externally, and that's considered a superior method for concepts.
The good news from this information is that by taking notes, you kickstart your brain to organize concepts in a way that makes it easier to retrieve them later. Summarizing what you are hearing or reading engages your brain in rehearsal processes that immediately start to strengthen ideas as they're prepared to be consolidated into long-term memory. Of course, the sooner you take notes, the less forgetting occurs. And handwriting notes keeps you attentive and actively engaged in the material in ways that are typically lacking when you type verbatim on a laptop. So notes are definitely necessary. Tip number 2, cultivate curiosity. It happens. At some point you may have to take a class that you're really not interested in, or you may get a professor who doesn't inspire you. Don't let the boring class lower your average and undermine your success. Instead, use curiosity to supercharge your ability to pay attention and encode new information. Recent research hints that curiosity is even more valuable than we had thought.
Our study revealed three major findings. Curiosity seems to put the brain in a state that is very conducive to learning. So you could think of it something like a vortex that draws in things that you're motivated to learn, but it draws in everything around it. The second finding was that we saw, once curiosity was aroused, we saw increased activity in the nucleus accumbens and in the substantia nigra ventral tegmental area complex, the SNVTA.
In other words, higher levels of curiosity were associated with more activity in dopamine pathways.
So our third major finding was that when people were anticipating the answer to a question that they're highly curious about, we see activity increasing in the hippocampus. And this increase, in turn, is predictive of people's ability to later on retain the information that they learned about the answers to these trivia questions. So putting it all together, curiosity seems to increase interactions between the SNVTA and the hippocampus, and that seems to put the brain in a state that's more likely to retain new information, even if that information is not what got you curious in the first place.
In fact, games designers know how to keep you motivated. They start by making you establish an attractive goal, like, I want to reach the next level. Then they provide information that helps you recognize that the task required is both challenging and achievable. They provide useful feedback at critical junctures, and they reward you throughout the game as you achieve even small successes along the way. The good news from this information is that being curious makes your brain ready to learn whatever is encountered next, even if it's something you're not actively interested in. So if you aren't naturally motivated in a class, you'll benefit by cultivating curiosity. Curiosity stimulates your reward system in much the same way as you experience when you win a game. In turn, this stimulation enhances learning by encoding information that you're not actually paying attention to, and thereby amplifies the amount of information that is remembered. If you do encounter a class that fails to pique your interest, you might try to turn it into a game of sorts, challenging yourself to achieve incremental goals. Or awaken your inner child and keep asking why until you find an aspect of the subject that does pique your curiosity. Being curious about one thing enables learning of the less interesting information that is experienced at the same time. As Dr. Gruber put it, when you're curious about something, your brain is like a vortex, drawing in the things you're motivated to learn, but also drawing in everything around it. So far, we've been talking about strategies to get information into the brain. Next, we'll look at ways to make it stick. Tip number 3, study smarter. Now that you've laid the groundwork with notes and have stored a myriad of new concepts in long-term memory, there are a number of things you can do to strengthen and elaborate those concepts and your understanding of how to apply them when needed. This involves retrieval from long-term memory to short-term memory, rehearsal in short-term memory, and then updating and consolidating back into long-term memory. The key here is rehearsal, how you think about what you're learning. The brain loves solving puzzles. It's a very satisfying experience. So if you review your notes with a focus on identifying gaps in your understanding, you will stimulate deeper learning in a very natural way. Here's another little video clip about the importance of practicing memory retrieval.
One goal of learning is to get information into long-term memory so we can use it later when we need it. Long-term memory is relatively permanent. However, if we want to maintain easy access to a memory, we need to retrieve that information regularly.
Here are 5 research-based strategies for studying that are guaranteed to make your study time more productive. First, taking a break while working on a difficult problem increases the probability that you'll solve the problem and shortens the time it will take. Experts recommend working on a problem for about 45 minutes or an hour and then taking a distraction break for 5 or 10 minutes. This is a specific kind of break that is a complete distraction from studying. Check email, eat something, exercise, and always set a timer. This intellectual pause gives your brain an opportunity to consolidate newly acquired information into long-term memory and help prevent overloading short-term memory. You do have to return to what you were working on, but you're more likely to solve a problem or have an aha moment after taking a break than if you had continued working straight through. Second, when you test yourself on what you've been learning to identify gaps in your understanding, you accelerate learning. Your brain loves to fill in the gaps. Self-testing could be going through questions from the textbook, mentally reciting relevant facts or terms from memory, or asking yourself to elaborate on what you meant as you read through your notes. The goal here is to point out gaps in your understanding so your brain can work on closing them. Third, you might have been very successful with cramming so far, but that is because your short-term memory could hold enough information to pass the test you were taking in the next day or two. Cramming puts lots of information into short-term memory, but deeper understanding requires storing information in long-term memory. A better strategy to achieve deeper understanding is incremental study. Let's say you were going to spend 4 hours Sunday night cramming for a test on Monday morning. A better strategy would be to spend an hour per night on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and then no studying on Sunday. Those long breaks between study periods allow your brain to consolidate the concepts you're learning and store them in long-term memory where they can be retrieved more easily. One study showed that students learned twice as much material when they studied in increments than when they studied the same amount of time the day before the test. Double the recall with no extra time and no extra effort. Fourth, many students say that procrastination is their biggest impediment to success in their classes. With a little twist, you can still procrastinate a little. As soon as you get a new assignment, write down the title of the project and think about it for 15 or so minutes, jotting down a few ideas. Then put it out of your mind for a few days until you're ready to really work on it. This begins an internal conversation about the subject in your brain that takes place in the background without you even being aware of it. By the time you've gathered resources to begin the project in earnest, you'll already have a lot of ideas sitting ready to retrieve from memory. And these ideas wouldn't exist if you hadn't spent that 15 minutes on it several days before. And fifth, everyone agrees the best way to learn something is to teach it. Even preparing to teach a topic is helpful, but ideally, you need to actually articulate your thoughts to another person and have them react to your presentation of the concepts. This engages not only your brain in finding gaps in your understanding, but it also engages another person to poke at areas that you may not even realize need more attention. The good news from this information is that you don't have to dedicate hours and hours of grueling study time to learn new material. By revisiting your notes often and quizzing yourself to reveal any gaps in your understanding, you keep your brain's automatic processes actively working behind the scenes. Use your time wisely by choosing efficient study strategies and taking distraction breaks from time to time. And at least ask yourself how you would teach the topic to someone else. This will present you with plenty of fruitful aha moments. Tip number 4. Sleep on it. Incredibly, while we sleep, our brains behave in many of the same ways as when we're studying, but we're not aware of it. When we sleep, the brain automatically and systematically reviews all of the information we encountered throughout the day. Information that is deemed unimportant, largely because we did not intentionally try to remember it again, is allowed to deteriorate. Information that is deemed valuable is replayed over and over, and then reconsolidated and placed in long-term memory in a much more stable state. Here's how an expert describes it.
Whether you're cramming for an exam or trying to learn a new musical instrument or even trying to perfect a new sport, sleep may actually be your secret memory weapon. Studies have actually told us that sleep is critical for memory in at least 3 different ways. First, we know that you need sleep before learning to actually get your brain ready, almost like a dry sponge, ready to initially soak up new information. And without sleep, the memory circuits within the brain effectively become waterlogged, as it were, and we can't absorb new information. We can't effectively lay down those new memory traces. But it's not only important that you sleep before learning, because we also know that you need sleep after learning to essentially hit the save button on those new memories so that we don't forget. In fact, sleep will actually future-proof that information within the brain, cementing those memories into the architecture of those neural networks. And we've begun to discover exactly how sleep achieves this memory consolidation benefit. The first mechanism is a file transfer process. And here we can speak about 2 different structures within the brain. The first is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus sits on the left and the right side of your brain. And you can think of the hippocampus almost like the informational inbox of your brain. It's very good at receiving new memory files and holding on to them. The second structure that we can speak about is called the cortex, this wrinkled mass of tissue that sits on top of your brain. And during deep sleep, there is this file transfer mechanism. Think of the hippocampus like a USB stick and your cortex like the hard drive. And during the day, we're going around and we're gathering lots of files. But then during deep sleep at night, because of that limited storage capacity, we have to transfer those files from the hippocampus over to the hard drive of the brain, the cortex. And that's exactly one of the mechanisms that deep sleep seems to provide. But there's another mechanism that we've become aware of that helps cement those memories into the brain. And it's called replay. Several years ago, scientists were looking at how rats learned as they would run around a maze. And they were recording the activity in the memory centers of these rats. And as the rat was running around the maze, different brain cells would code different parts of the maze. And so if you added a tone to each one of the brain cells, what you would hear as the rat was starting to learn the maze was the signature of that memory. So it would sound a little bit like. It was this signature of learning that we could hear. But then they did something clever. They kept listening to the brain as these rats fell asleep. And what they heard was remarkable. The rat, as it was sleeping, started to replay that same memory signature. But now it started to replay it almost 10 times faster than it was doing when it was awake. So now instead you would start to hear. That seems to be the second way in which sleep can actually strengthen these memories. Sleep is actually replaying and scoring those memories into a new circuit within the brain, strengthening that memory representation. The final way in which sleep is beneficial for memory is integration and association. In fact, we're now learning that sleep is much more intelligent than we ever imagined. Sleep doesn't just simply strengthen individual memories. Sleep will actually cleverly interconnect new memories together. And as a consequence, you can wake up the next day with a revised mind-wide web of associations. We can come up with solutions to previously impenetrable problems. And this is probably the reason that you've never been told to stay awake on a problem. Instead, you're told to sleep on a problem. And that's exactly what the science is teaching us.
The good news from this information is that we can use subconscious processes while we sleep to firm up and deepen memories that are associated with what we're studying. In fact, sleep is a lot like studying. Misconceptions and partial understandings are replaced with improved knowledge, and shutting down the prefrontal cortex allows your subconscious to work on solving problems that have been on your mind during the day. If you think about a difficult problem just before going to sleep, you increase the chance of your brain dreaming about it and even solving the problem for you. So definitely sleep on it. So here again are those 4 tips to help improve learning. First, notes are necessary, not only to guard against forgetting, but also because the process of handwriting notes kickstarts critical neural processes that are necessary for learning new material. Second, cultivating curiosity capitalizes on heightened learning when the reward system is active, and enables you to learn at a high level even when the material is not that interesting to you. Third, studying smarter allows you to dramatically improve the quality of learning without increasing the amount of time you spend studying. And fourth, sleeping on it takes advantage of powerful neural processes that only happen when the prefrontal cortex is inactive. Getting enough sleep ensures that your brain is stashing away new learning in long-term memory and clearing out short-term memory for the next day.